Hello. Hello, hello. Happy. What the heck? Monday. Oh my god, it's only Monday. That's sad. But you know what? It's okay. It has to be Monday sometimes. Happy Monday. Today we are getting a little bit further in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. We're 66% of the way through the book. And after today, we'll see how far we get. They're passing the Atlantic right now. That is what I believe we left on last time. So let's see what this chapter brings on their journey across the Atlantic. There we go. Okay, let's just jump right in. Shall we? We shall. Okay. Chapter 11. The Sargasso Sea. The direction of the Nautilus had not changed. All hope of returning into the European seas had now to be abandoned for the time being. Captain Nemo held a southerly direction. Where was he leading us? I dare not imagine. The day the Nautilus crossed an unusual area of the Atlantic Ocean. Everyone had heard of the existence of this great current of warm water that is known as the Gulf Stream. After leaving the Florida channels, it winds its way around the Spitzbergen. But before entering the Gulf of Mexico, at latitude 44° north, the current divides into two streams. The main one flows toward the coasts of Ireland and Norway, while the second turns toward the south near the Azores. Then, touching the shores of Africa and describing a long oval, it flows back toward the Antilles. This second arm, more like a collar than an arm, surrounds with its rings of warm water a colder area of the ocean, a quiet, tranquil area called the Sargasso Sea, a veritable lake in the midst of the ocean. The waters of the Gulf Stream take no less than 3 years to travel right around it. The Sargasso Sea, properly speaking, covers the whole of the submerged part of Atlantis. Some writers have even maintained that the numerous types of weed that are found in its waters arise from the ancient prairies of this former continent. It is more probable, however, that these weeds, algae, and fucus, carried away from the shores of Europe and America, are brought to the area of the Gulf Stream. It was this hypothesis that led Columbus to believe in the existence of a new world. When the ships of this bold explorer reared the Sargasso Sea, they had considerable difficulty in sailing through those deep weeds, which impeded their progress. The crews of his ships were terrified, but they lost 3 long weeks crossing it. Such was the region of the Nautilus was now visiting, a veritable prairie, a tight woven carpet of weeds, of floating fucus, of tropical pokeweed, which was so thick and compact that the prow of a large ship would not have plowed through it without serious difficulty. Captain Nemo had no desire to engage his propeller in this mass of weed, and kept his ship several meters below the surface. The name Sargasso comes from the Spanish sargazo, which means seaweed. This weed, also called kelp or bank. The theory advanced by the learned Maury to explain the presence of these hydrophytes in this tranquil basin of the Atlantic is found in his work, Physical Geography of the Sea. The presence of this seaweed, he says, is due to the phenomenon similar to everybody. If one were to put pieces of cork or fragments in any floating material in a basin of water, and a circular motion was given to the water, one would soon see the scattered fragments come together in the center of this liquid surface. That is, there where there is the least motion. It is this phenomenon with which we are concerned. The basin is the Atlantic, the circular current of the liquid is the Gulf Stream, and the center, where all the floating fragments come together, is the Sargasso Sea. I share Maury's opinion and have the opportunity to study the phenomenon in a special area where ships rarely sail. Above us floated bodies of all kinds, trapped in the midst of those brownish colored weeds. Tree trunks, ripped from the Andes or of the Rocky Mountains, carried down by the Amazon or the Mississippi, parts of the wrecked ships, the remains of keels and ship's buttons, battered planks so weighed down with barnacles and shells that they could no longer rise to the surface of the ocean. And time will one day prove Maury's other theory that these materials, accumulated over centuries, will change to mineral form by the action of the water. Hi, Colin. And then provide inexhaustible coal fields, a precious reserve that far-sighted nature is now preparing for the day when men will have exhausted the mines on the continents. In the midst of this inexplicable tangle of weeds and fucus, I notice beautiful starred alacans of a pink hue, actinices, which trailed their long mantle of tentacles, green, red, and blue jellyfish. And above all, the large rhizostoma of Cuvier, with bluish umbrella shape, is bordered with a violet festoon. Throughout the whole day of February 22nd, we remained in the Sargasso Sea, where the fish, lovers of marine plants, and the crustacea find abundant food. The next day, the oceans presented its normal aspect again. For 19 days, from February 23rd to March 12th, the Nautilus, keeping to the middle of the Atlantic, sailed at a constant speed of 100 leagues every 24 hours. Captain Nemo evidently wanted to complete his underwater voyage, and I had no doubts that his intention, after doubling Cape Horn, was to return toward the southern seas of the Pacific. Ned Land had, therefore, good reason to be apprehensive. In the midst of these vast seas, with no visible islands, he could no longer think of deserting the ship. There was no way to oppose Captain Nemo's wishes either. The only thing to do was to accept the inevitable. What could no longer be achieved by force or trickery, I hoped to achieve by persuasion. When this voyage was over, might Captain Nemo not give us back our freedom under oath, never to reveal his existence? An oath of honor that we would certainly have kept. We would have to discuss this delicate matter with the captain. Was I in a position, however, to request this freedom? He himself had definitely declared from the very beginning that the secret of this life required our perpetual imprisonment aboard the Nautilus. Would not my silence during 4 months seem to him to be a tacit acceptance of the situation? To return to the subject would probably have the result of merely arousing his suspicions, which might hamper our plans in any favorable occasion, where to arise in the future to warrant another attempt. All these reasons troubled my mind. I weighed them and discussed them with Conseil, who was all bewildered as I. All in all, even though I was not easily discouraged, I realized that the chances of ever returning to our fellow men diminished with every day that went by. Above all, at a time when Captain Nemo was heading boldly toward the southern Atlantic. During those 19 days mentioned above, nothing unusual happened. The captain kept very busy, and I rarely saw him. I would often find books left half open in the library, especially books on natural history. He had evidently been leafing through his own work, dealing with the mysteries of the deep. It lay open with his comments in the margin, some of which contradicted my theories and my classifications. He hardly ever discussed these matters with me. He seemed satisfied just to revise and correct them. Occasionally I heard strains of melancholy music. He played his organ with a great deal of expression, but only during the night when the sea was shrouded in darkness and the Nautilus in slumber in the vast desert of the sea. I didn't know they had an organ aboard the Nautilus. And also Captain Nemo, of course, he fucking knows how to play an organ. My God. Uh, um, During this stage of the journey, we cruised on the surface for days on end. The sea appeared deserted. We saw a few sailing ships on their way to the Indies, making for the Cape of Good Hope. One day, we were pursued by boats of a whaler, which had undoubtedly taken us for a huge whale of great value. But Captain Nemo did not wish to make these hardy men waste their time and efforts, and he ended the chase by plunging beneath the waves. This incident seemed to interest Ned Land very much. I should not be wrong, I believe, were I to say that the captain was very sorry that our ship could not be harpooned to death by those whalers. The fish Conseil and I saw during this period differed from those we had already observed in the latitudes. However, we did see some specimens of that terrible genus of cartilaginous fish, divided into three genre that comprise no fewer than 32 species. Striped sharks about 15 feet long, whose heads are flat and bigger than their bodies, with a rounded tail fin, and whose backs carry 7 wide blank hands that run parallel down their backs. There are some Paralon sharks with a cinder gray color, pierced with 7 bronchial openings and provided with a single dorsal fin placed roughly in the middle of their bodies. Some large sea dogs also passed by, a voracious fish, if there ever was one. Excuse me. One may well doubt stories told by the fishermen, but there are some stories they tell. In the body of one of these, a buffalo's head and a whole calf uniform, a horse complete with rider. All this, frankly, is not credible. But what is certain is that none of these ever allowed themselves to be caught in the nets of the Nautilus, and that I was never able to verify their veracity. Schools of elegant and playful dolphins accompanied us for days on end. They traveled in groups of 5 or 6, hunting in packs like roaming wolves on land. These, moreover, are as voracious as the sea dogs. If one is to believe a professor from Copenhagen who retrieved 13 porpoises and 15 seals from the stomach of a dolphin, it was, it is true, a grampus, who belonged to the biggest species known, whose length sometimes measures more than 24 feet. This family of dolphins includes 10 genera, and those I saw belonged to the Delphinian genus. These are distinguishable by their excessively long, straight snout, which is 4 times the length of the skull. Their bodies, measuring 10 feet, are black on top, pinkish white on the underside, and are occasionally speckled. I should also mention some curious examples of fish belonging to the order of Acanthopertidae and the family of Cyendae found in the sea. Some writers, more poets than naturalists, claim that these fish sing melodiously, and their voices, when singing in unison, provide a concert equal to or better than a choir of human voices. I do not deny all this, but the Sienade do not serenade us on our way, much to our regret. Kind of want to know about this. Should we look into this? Is it research time? I think it's research time. So, first, let's find out. See, ne day pronunciation. Cyanidai. 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 Okay, cyanidai. Cyanidai. Okay, yeah, that does look like cyanidai. All right, let's see what it looks like. So, cyanidai. Cyanidai. Okay, it looks like a pretty basic fish. Cyanidai. There's another one. Pretty basic. But I'm curious about, because the book was saying that they sing. Drumming sounds they make, called drums or croakers, in reference to the repetitive throbbing or drumming sounds they make. The family. Okay. Cyanidae. Cyanidae. Sound. I want to hear what they sound like. Atlantic croakers, they're also called. Look at that guy. He's like, yeah, I sing songs. Cyanidae. Cyanidae. Oh, cool. That doesn't really sound like a beautiful chorus of angels like the book describes. I hear the drumming though. Huh. Okay, cool. Thanks, Google. I learned about cyanide. Cyanide. Finally, Conseil classified a large number of flying fish also. Nothing was more curious than to see the dolphin chasing them with incredible precision. However far they flew, whatever direction they took, sometimes even when flying right over the Nautilus, these ill-fated fish always found a way to land in the mouths of the dolphins ready to receive them. Then there was also pyropeds and flying gurnards with their luminous mouths, which at night, after tracing dazzling paths through the air, plunged beneath the dark waters like falling stars. Until March 13th, we continued sailing in this matter. That day, however, the Nautilus undertook some experiments in taking soundings of ocean depths, which interested me very much. We had traveled almost 13,000 leagues since leaving the high seas of the Pacific. Our bearings showed our position to be latitude 45 degree 37 south and longitude 37 degree 53 west. It was the same area where Captain Denham of the Herald had sounded over 45,000 feet without touching the bottom. There, too, Lieutenant Parker of the United States frigate Congress had not been able to touch bottom with soundings just short of 50,000 feet. Captain Nemo decided to take his Nautilus to the greatest depth of the ocean in order to check these different soundings. I prepared to take notes of the results of this experiment. The panels of the saloon were operated, and the maneuvers began in this attempt to reach the remotest depths of the sea. It was out of the question to dive by filling the tanks. Perhaps we could not have increased sufficiency and specific weight of the Nautilus for that. Besides, in order to rise to the surface again, it would have been necessary to rid the ship of this surcharge of water, and the pumps would have been sufficiently powerful to overcome the outside pressure. Captain Nemo decided to reach the bottom of the ocean by taking a sufficiently long diagonal direction, using the lateral fins set at an angle of 45 degrees to the waterline of the Nautilus. Then the propeller was set to its maximum speed, and its quadruple blade churned the water with indescribable power. Under the powerful thrust, the hull of the Nautilus vibrated like the string of a musical instrument and plowed its way beneath the waves. The captain and I, stationed in the saloon, followed the needle of the manometer, which moved rapidly. Soon we had dived below the level where most fish can live. If some fish can live only on the surface of the sea or the rivers, others, few in number to be sure, live in the great depths. Among the latter, I noticed the hexancus, a sort of sea dog, which has 6 respiratory openings, a telescope fish with its enormous eyes, the armored malamat with gray fins and black pectorals, and whose pale red breasts are protected by bony plaques. Finally, I saw the grenadier, which, having at a depth of about 4,000 feet, bears a pressure of 120 atmospheres. I asked Captain Nemo whether he had seen fish at still greater depths. Fish, he replied, rarely, but in the present state of science, what do we know about this project? We know, Captain, that on reaching the lower depths of the ocean, vegetable life disappears at a higher level than animal life. We know that where living creatures can still be found, not a single hydrophyte can be found. We know that oysters and some species of scallops live at a depth of over 6,000 feet, and that McClintock, a hero of the polar seas, brought up a living starfish from the depth of no less than 8,000 feet. We also know that the crew of the Bulldog, belonging to the Royal Navy, fished up a starfish from the depth of over 15,000 feet. In other words, more than a league down. How can you say, Captain Nemo, that we know nothing on this subject? No, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the captain. I should not be so presumptuous. Nevertheless, I should like to ask you, how do you explain the fact that living creatures can live at such depths? I explain it on 2 grounds, I answered. First, because there are vertical currents caused by the differences in salinity and the densities of the waters that produce a movement which is sufficient to support the rudimentary life of the ancridae and the starfish. Quite right, said the captain. Secondly, if oxygen is the basic requirement of life, we know that the quantity of oxygen dissolves in seawater increases the depth rather than diminishes. And that the greater the pressure at the lower levels, the more of it goes into solution. Ah, so you scientists know that, replied the captain, somewhat surprised. Well, Monsieur le Professeur, there are solid reasons for believing it, because it is true. I should add, furthermore, that the watery bladders of fish contain more nitrogen than oxygen when they are caught at the surface, and more oxygen than nitrogen when they are caught at great depths. Which only goes to prove your point. But let us continue with our observations. My glance fell on the manometer again. The instrument indicated that we were at a depth of about 20,000 feet. We had been diving for an hour. The Nautilus was gliding on her inclined fins, plunging deeper and deeper. The barren waters were magnificently transparent and possessed a diaphanous quality that no paintbrush could ever paint. An hour later, we had reached a depth of over 43,000 feet, approximately and a quarter leagues, and there were no signs yet that we were approaching the bottom of the sea. You know, I was just thinking about this while I was reading this. Like, the book is called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but I don't think we've been 20,000 leagues under the sea yet. So I am like curious when, like, are they going to do that? Like, when is going to be the big decision that they're going to finally go 20,000 leagues under the sea? Like, I'm wondering if it's going to be right now. At about 45,000 feet, however, I noticed some blackish peaks rising in the midst of the waters. But these summits could be the peaks of mountains as high as the Himalayas, or Mont Blanc, or even higher, and the depth of their valleys was still undetermined. The Nautilus dived still deeper, despite the powerful pressures it was being subjected to. I could feel its steel plates vibrating at the joints, its bulkheads quivered, the willows of the saloon seemed to bulge under the pressure of the waters. And this solid vessel would have been crushed without doubt, had it not been capable, as its captain said, of resisting like a solid rock. As we brushed past those rocky slopes low beneath the waters, I saw a few surviving conchs, some serpulae, some living spinorbs, and specimens of starfish. Soon, however, these last representatives of animal life disappeared altogether, and more than 3 leagues down, the Nautilus had dived below the level that marks the limit of marine life, just as a balloon can rise above the zone where breathing is no longer possible. We had reached a depth of over 50,000 feet, 4 leagues, and the hull of the Nautilus was then bearing a pressure of 1,600 atmospheres, that is to say, of about 24,000 pounds of every square inch of its surface. What an incredible experience, I exclaimed, to explore the utmost depths of the ocean where no man has ever been. Look, Captain, look at those magnificent world rocks, those magnificent rocks, those uninhabited grottos, the last refuges of the world where life is no longer possible. What unknown haunts! What a pity that no one can only carry back the memory of all this. Would you like, Captain Nemo asked me, to carry back something more than just a memory? What do you mean? I mean that nothing is easier than to take a photograph of these regions. I had barely time to express my astonishment at this new overture when, at the captain's request, a camera was brought in. Through the open panels, the waters, illuminated by the brilliant gleams of the searchlight, spread before us with perfect limpidity. No shadows blurred the crystal clearness of those depths. The sun itself could not have been more favorable. The Nautilus, under the thrusts of her propellers, controlled by her inclined fins, stood perfectly still. The camera was leveled was leveled at that submerged landscape, and in a few seconds we had a negative of incredible clearness. That print, still in my possession, is positive evidence. It shows those primordial rocks that have never been seen in the light of day, those massive blocks of granite which form the powerful axis of the earth. Lying in the lowest depths of the sea, whose deep grottos hollowed out among those rocky masses, all defined in their outlines with incompassable dark clearness, as if painted by the brush of a great Flemish artist. Beyond a landscape of mountains, in an undulating line of shapes and shadows, sleek, black, polished heights, without a trace of moss, without a stain, molded into a fantastic vision, and firmly resting on a carpet of sand, which sparkled under the brilliant glow of our searchlight. Then Captain Nemo, after having taken the photograph, said, "We must go back, Monsieur le Professeur. We must not abuse our power, nor expose the Nautilus to such pressures for too long." "Let us go back up then," I said. "Hold on tight." Before I had time to realize what the captain had meant, I was suddenly thrown to the floor. With her propeller thrown into gear, her fins set vertically, the Nautilus shot up like a balloon in the air and rose with vertiginous speed. She sliced through the watery mass with a high-pitched tremor. Nothing but a blur was visible on the way up. In 4 minutes, she had crashed through the four leagues that separated her from the surface of the ocean, and emerging like a flying fish, she fell back on the water, splashing waves to an incredible height. Okay, that was chapter 11. Man, that chapter flew by. I don't know why that one was more interesting to me than the other ones, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 pages is the next chapter. Um, that was nice. I enjoyed that chapter. Um, okay, now after hearing though what the Nautilus can handle, I don't think that they can go 20,000 leagues under the sea, because they were only like 5 leagues under the sea, and it was seeming like they wouldn't be able to do that. They were saying the pressure was too great. So, I don't know. It does make me wonder why the title is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, though. Like, maybe all the depths that they've traveled altogether will have amounted to 20,000 leagues or something like that. I'm not sure. But yeah, that was chapter 11. Time to get into the next chapter, which is called Cachalots and Whales, which I'm really excited about because whales are one of my favorite animals ever. I don't really remember what a cachalot is, though. Shall we look this one up too? Oh, it's a type of whale. Oh, it's these cool guys with the mouths. Look at this happy guy. Wait. Cachalots. Cachalots refers to the sperm whale. Oh, a large toothed whale. Okay, cool. Yay. Um, okay, I guess we'll get into this chapter. I feel the need to tell you though, I had a dream about whales the other night. Um, so as we know, whales are one of my favorite animals. And they're one of my favorite animals because I feel like if I were an animal, I would be a whale. Um, but anyway, um, so I was on a boat with some people. I don't remember who the people were. And there were whales swimming in the water. And someone on the boat with me was like, "Do you want to join them?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." Um, so I jumped in the water and started swimming with the whales and just observing them. And it was a dream, so things made sense that wouldn't make sense. And under the water, I could see perfectly clearly. I could see exactly everything before me. And as one whale went by me, I grabbed onto its tail like that. Um, right at the part of the tail where it like goes in before going out. I grabbed onto the tail and just kind of held on as it swam through the water. And then that whale that I was holding on to did the thing where it like surfaces and jumps out and then splashes down onto the water. And I just felt fine. I felt wonderful actually. And then when we got under the water and swam a little bit more, I let go of the whale. And I remember looking out and thinking, I know whales don't eat humans, but in the dream, it made sense. I was all of a sudden really scared that the whale would eat me, but it didn't. It just looked at me and went back to swimming. And it was just one of the best dreams I've ever had. Um, I don't usually get super good dreams, so I'm really grateful when I do get good ones. And yeah, I was just so stoked about that dream, swimming with the whales. Anyway, all this being said, let's get back into the story, which apparently is about to involve a lot of whales, which is why I told you all this. Thank you for listening. Okay, chapter 12, Cachalots and Whales. During the night of the 13th to 14th, the Nautilus again resumed its southerly course. I thought that once it had reached the latitude of Cape Horn, it would head toward the west and sail into the Pacific to complete its tour around the world. Nothing of the kind happened. The Nautilus continued to sail toward the southern regions. Where was it heading for? To the pole? This was insane. I began to think that Captain Nemo's rashness more than justified the apprehensions of Ned Land. For some time now, the Canadian had not spoken of his plans to escape. He had become less communicative, almost silent. I could see how heavily this prolonged imprisonment was weighing on him. I could sense that his anger was beginning to tell on him. Whenever he met the captain, his eyes lit up with sinister fire, and I feared that some day his natural aggressiveness might lead him to do something rash. That day, March 14th, he and Conseil came to see me in my room. I asked them why they had come to see me. I have a simple question to ask, monsieur, the Canadian answered. Yes, Ned, what is it? How many men do you think there are aboard the Nautilus? I couldn't say, my friend. It seems to me, Ned Land went on, that it shouldn't take much of a crew to run this ship. I don't think so either. Everything considered, I believe 10 men could handle her. Well, said the Canadian, why should there be more? Why indeed, I remarked. I was staring closely at Ned Land, whose intentions were easy to guess. Because, I said, if my guess is correct, and if I have fully understood the captain's raison d'etre, the Nautilus is not merely a ship. It must be a place of refuge for all of us who, like her commander, have broken off all ties with land. Perhaps, said Conseil. But presumably, the Nautilus can only house a certain number of men. Could Monsieur not estimate the maximum? How could I conceal? By by using mathematics. Monsieur knows the capacity of the vessel, the volume of air it contains. Monsieur knows how much air each man uses with each breath. Monsieur also knows that the Nautilus has to rise to the surface every 24 hours. Can Monsieur not calculate? Conseil did not finish his sentence, but I realized what he was getting at. I understand, I said, but the calculation you speak of, easy enough to work out, will only give us a very uncertain result. Why not try? Why not try? Ned Land insisted. Well, let us analyze the problem, I replied. Each man consumes in 1 hour the oxygen contained in 100 liters, or 3.5 cubic feet of air. In 24 hours, he consumes then the oxygen contained in 2,400 liters. We must therefore see how many times 2,400 liters of air will go into the Nautilus. Exactly, said Conseil. Well then, I continued, the capacity of the Nautilus is 1,500 tons, and since each ton contains 1,000 liters, the Nautilus contains 1,500,000 liters of air, which, divided by 2,400, I made rapid calculation with a pencil, gives 625, which indicates that the Nautilus could store enough air for 625 men for a period of 24 hours. 625! Cried Ned. You may be sure, I added, that if we include all the officers and passengers, it would only add up to 1/10 that number. It is still too many for 3 men, murmured Conseil. Hence, my poor Ned, I can only advise you to be patient. And better than patience, resignation, replied Conseil. Oh, sorry. And better than patience, resignation, replied Conseil. Conseil had used the right word. After all, he continued, Captain Nemo cannot sail south indefinitely. Sooner or later he will have to stop. Who knows? He may even be impeded by an iceberg. He will have to return to well-traveled lanes again, and then we can reconsider Ned's plan to escape. The Canadian shook his head, ran his hand over his brow, and without replying, left the room. Would Monsieur allow me to express an opinion? Said Conseil. Our poor Ned always wants what he cannot have. Everything stems from his past life. Everything that is forbidden or is a source of despair for him. His memories oppress him, and his heart is heavy. One must try to understand him. What can he do here? Nothing. He's not a scientist like Monsieur. He cannot possibly derive the same pleasure that we do by looking at the marvels of the sea. He would risk all to get back to a tavern back home. To be sure, the monotony aboard must have been intolerable for the Canadian, who was used to an active and outdoor life. Incidents that might interest him happen rarely. On that day, however, an incident occurred that reminded him of his past glories as a harpooner. About 11 o'clock in the morning, cruising on the surface of the ocean, the Nautilus came upon a herd of whales. Such an occurrence did not surprise me, for I know that these animals, hunted mercilessly everywhere, have sought refuge on the coldest regions they could find. The role played by whales in the marine world and their influence on geological discoveries have been considerable. It was the whale that first led the Basques in their wake, followed by Asturians, the English, and the Dutch, and taught these mariners how to brave the dangers of the ocean, and led them to both ends of the world. Whales love to frequent the Arctic as well as the Antarctic seas. There are ancient legends that claim that these animals had led whalers to within 16 or 17 miles of the pole. However false the claim may be, it well it may well happen someday because in hunting these animals in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, the whalers will reach these two unknown areas of the world. We were sitting here on the platform in a calm sea, enjoying one of those fine autumn days that the month of October offers in these regions, when the Canadian sighted a whale on the eastern horizon. He could not be mistaken. Looking at it carefully, he could see its dark back rising and falling just beneath the surface of the waves, about 5 miles away. "Ah," cried Ned, "if only I were aboard a whaler! What a pleasure that would be! It's a very big fellow. Look at the power behind those columns of air and mist he is spouting. Great God! What do I have to be shut up in this piece of steel?" "Well, Ned," I replied, "haven't you given up your old notions of fishing?" "Can a whaler ever forget his trade, monsieur? Can a whaler ever forget the excitement of such a pursuit?" Have you never fished in these You've never fished in these seas, have you, Ned?" "Never, monsieur. Only on the northern seas, in the Bering Strait and Davis Strait. These have southern whales. Then these southern whales are strangers to you. You have only hunted whales that would never venture beyond the warm waters of the equator." "Ah, monsieur le professeur, what are you trying to tell me?" replied the Canadian, in an incredulous tone of voice. "I am telling you only what is true." "That is nonsense. 2.5 years ago, in 1865, I hauled in a whale near Greenland and found a harpoon embedded in its flesh and the mark of a whaler from the Bering Sea. Now I ask you, how could that whale, after being wounded west of America, come to be killed in the east if it had not crossed the equator, after having either made its way around Cape Horn or around the Cape of Good Hope?" "I agree with Ned," said Conseil, "and I am waiting for Monsieur's answer." Monsieur's answer, my friends, is that whales, depending on their species, remain in their native waters and never leave them. So if one of those animals comes from the Bering Strait to the Davis Strait, or is simply either along the northern coast of America or along the coast of Asia. "And you expect us to take you seriously?" asked the Canadian, winking with one eye. "We must believe monsieur," replied Conseil. "If that is the case," continued the Canadian, "since I have never hunted in these waters, I don't know the whales that frequent them. Is that right?" "That is what I said, Ned." "All the more reason for getting acquainted," replied Conseil. "Oh, all the more reason for getting acquainted," replied Conseil. "Look! Look!" cried the Canadian, his voice full of emotion. "She's drawing near. She's coming up to us. She's defying me. She knows that I can't do a thing to her." Ned was stamping his foot. His hand shook as he banished an imaginary harpoon. "These cretins," he asked, "are they as big as those at the Northern Sea?" "About the same, Ned." "I've seen some pretty big whales, monsieur. Whales which measured up to 100 feet in length. I've even heard that the Hullamuck of the Umgallic of the Aleutian Islands sometimes measure over 150 feet. "That is somewhat exaggerated," I reply. "Those Aleutian animals are only Balanoptorians with dorsal fins, and like the cachalots, they are generally smaller than the Greenland whales, you know?" "Ah," cried the Canadian, who had not taken his eyes off the ocean. She's coming closer. She's coming right up to the Nautilus. Then, continuing his conversation, you speak of the cachalot, monsieur, as if it were a small creature. They are, they say, gigantic cachalots. They are intelligent crustaceans. Some, as it said, dress up with weeds and fucus. They are taken for small islands, and fishermen set up camps on them, settle down, build fires, and build houses on them also, don't they? Said Conseil. That's right, you joker, replied Ned Land. Then one fine day the creature takes the notion to dive, and all the inhabitants are sucked into the depths of the sea. Just like in the travels of Sinbad the Sailor, I retorted, laughing. Ah, Master Land, it seems that you are fond of tall tales, and those cachalot stories of yours are really amusing. I hope you do not take them too seriously. Monsieur le naturaliste, the Canadian replied in all seriousness. When it comes to whales, one can believe almost anything. Take a good look at the speed of that one. Notice how stealthily she dives. They say that those creatures can speed around the world in 15 days. I would not doubt it. But what you undoubtedly don't know, Monsieur Arenat, is that in the beginning of time, whales could swim even faster than they do now. Oh, really, Ned? And why was that? Because at that time, their tails were crosswise, just like fish, and they could swish the waves from right to left to left to right. When the Lord realized that they were swimming too fast, he twisted their tails. And from then on, they have had to beat the waves up and down, and of course, they lost some of their speed. You would not be joking, would you, Ned? I said, repeating an expression used by the Canadian. Don't take it seriously, answered Ned Land. No more did I tell you that there are whales 300 feet long, weighing 100,000 tons. That is a lot of weight, I said. However, we can admit that there are certain whales that grow to a considerable size, since some of them, they say, give us as much as 120 tons of oil. I know. I've seen them, said the Canadian. I believe you, Ned. Just as I believe that there are certain whales which attain the size of 100 elephants put together. Just imagine the effects of such a mass launched at full speed. Is it true, asked Conseil, that they can sink a ship? A ship? I do not think so, I replied. Nevertheless, it is said that in 1820, right on these southern seas, a whale rushed on the Essex and drove it backwards at a speed of over 12 feet per second. Waves entered astern, and the Essex sank almost immediately. Ned gazed at me quizzingly. I know, he said. I was hit once by the tail of a whale in an open canoe, of course. My companions and I were just thrown 20 feet in the air, believe it or not. But the whale, compared to the whale of the professor, was just a young baby. Do these animals live a long time? Conseil asked. 1,000 years, replied the Canadian, without hesitation. And how do you know, Ned? Because people say so. And why do people say so? Because they know. No, Ned, they don't know, but they think they know. And for this reason. 400 years ago, when fishermen had begun to hunt whales, these animals were larger than those we hunt now. It is assumed that, with some logic, we must admit that the smaller size of today's whales is due to the fact that they haven't had time to reach their full growth. This is what made buffoons say that they could live and did live 1,000 years. Do you understand? Ned Land did not understand. He was no longer listening. The whale was coming closer and closer, and he was devouring it with his eyes. Look, he cried. It's not a whale, but 10, 20, a whole herd of them. And I can't do a thing. Here I am tied hand and foot. But Ned, said Conseil, why don't you just ask Captain Nemo's permission to hunt them? Conseil had not quite finished his sentence when Ned Land rushed off and scrambled below to find the captain. A few seconds later, both of them appeared on the platform. Captain Nemo took a good look at the herd of whales frolicking on the waters a mile away from the Nautilus. They are southern whales, he said. This is a fortune of a whole fleet of whalers over there. Sir, asked the Canadian, can I have a go at them, even if it's only to remind me of my old trade? What good would it do to hunt them for the sole purpose of destroying them? Replied the captain. We can do nothing with whale oil aboard. Nevertheless, sir, continued the Canadian, you gave us permission to hunt a dugong. Then it was a matter of providing some fresh meat for my crew. Here it would be killing just for the sake of killing. I know very well that this is a privilege reserved for men, and I do not approve of these murderous pastimes, the destruction of these harmless and inoffensive creatures, such as the northern and right whales, by whalers like you, Ned, is a crime. You have already depopulated all of Baffin's Bay, and you will exterminate eventually a whole class of useful animals. Leave these poor creatures alone. They have enough natural enemies, such as the cachalot, the swordfish, and the sawfish to contend with, without adding another. You can imagine the Canadian's face while listening to this lesson in morals. Ned Land stared at the captain and obviously did not understand what he meant. The captain, nevertheless, was right. The barbarous slaughter lack of forethought shown by whalers would one day wipe out the last whale from the ocean. Ned Land whistled Yankee Doodle through his teeth, stuck his hands into his pockets, and turned his back to us. In the meantime, Captain Nemo kept his eyes on the herd of cetaceans, and turning to me, said, I was perfectly right in saying that these animals had enough enemies without adding men. That herd of whales will soon have a battle to contend with. Do you see, Monsieur Aronnax, those dark spots setting above the surface about 8 miles away? Yes, I do, I replied. They are cachalots. Dreadful creatures found in those waters. These murderers travel in packs of 200 or 300, and one is perfectly justified in exterminating them. The Canadian turned around quickly at the sound of these last words. Well, Captain, there is still time, on behalf of the whales, to... There is no point in taking any risks, Monsieur le Professeur. The Nautilus will suffice to disperse those cachalots. It is armed with a steel spear, which is just as effective as Master Land's harpoon, I imagine. The Canadian didn't even deign to shrug his shoulders. Attack those cetaceans with a spear. Who ever heard of such a thing? Wait, Monsieur Aronnax, said the captain. We will show you a hunt such as you have never seen before. There will be no mercy for those ferocious beasts. They are nothing but teeth and jaws. Teeth and jaws. There could be no better description of the Macrophilus cachalot, whose body sometimes measures over 80 feet. The enormous head of this cetacean is about a third of its total length. better armed than the ordinary whale, whose upper jaw is merely armed with whalebone. This animal has 25 large teeth, each about 10 inches long, cylinder shaped and pointed, each weighing over 2 pounds. In the upper part of this enormous head, there are large cavities, separated by cartilages, that contain up to 600 or 800 pounds of that precious oil called spermaceti. The cachalot is a rather clumsy animal, more like a tadpole than a fish, to use an expression by Fredol. It is badly built, being, so to speak, deficient along built, the whole of the left side of its frame, and it can see only with its right eye. Meanwhile, the monstrous herd was drawing closer and closer. They had seen the whales and were preparing to attack. One could foresee in advance a victory for the cachalots, not only because they were better adapted for attacking than their inoffensive adversaries, but also because they can remain longer underwater without coming up to breathe. There was barely enough time to go to the whale's rescue. The Nautilus submerged beneath the surface of the water. Conseil, Ned, and I took our places in front of the saloon's panels. Captain Nemo stood by the helmsman to maneuver the ship like an engine of destruction. Soon I heard the throbbing of the propeller increase as we gathered speed. The battle had already begun between the cachalots and the whales when the Nautilus arrived on the scene. The ship was maneuvered so as to split the herd of the attacking enemy. At first the whales showed little concern at the sight of the new monsters that had attacked them, but soon they were forced to be wary of the deadly thrusts. What a battle! Even Ned Land, overcome by the excitement of the struggle, kept clapping his hands. The Nautilus had become a formidable harpoon in the hands of its commander. Responsive to every whim of the helmsman, it hurled itself against the mass of flesh, splitting it cleanly, leaving behind two writhing halves. It seemed indifferent to the powerful blows of their tails against the hull, nor could one feel the impact of its blows against the monsters. Once it had slaughtered an animal, it rushed against another, veering swiftly so as not to miss its prey, moving forward and backward, diving when the creature dived, rising when the creature rose to the surface, striking full on or aslant, cutting, tearing, piercing with that destructive spur of every direction and at any speed. What a carnage! What noises on the surface of that sea! What sharp hissings and roars those terror-stricken creatures let out. In the midst of those waters so habitually calm, the strokes of their tails churned up swells as if a storm were raging. The Homeric laughter continued for an hour, and no escape was possible. On occasions, in groups of 10 or 12, they would try to crush the Nautilus with their weight. Through the panels, we could see their terrifying eyes and their huge mouths studded with teeth. Ned Land, beside himself, threatened and cursed them. We could feel them clinging to our ship like a pack of dogs, holding a wild boar and bay in the brushwood. But the Nautilus, with increasing speed, dragged them along or brought them back to the surface, unconcerned with either their enormous weight or their formidable grip. I'm wondering, like, witnessing this battle scene and knowing the conflict Ned is having, like, I'm wondering if Captain Nemo will, like, offer Ned a position where they're, like, kind of in control of these battleists. I maybe just made up a word, but these, like, big moments of battle, or maybe even, like, captaining, since it seems like Ned likes those roles where he's, like, able to witness, like, big fights, and, like, be a part of them. and hunts and stuff. Anyway, finally, the horde dispersed. The waves became calm again. I could feel the ship rising to the surface. The hatch was opened, and we rushed out to the platform. The sea was covered with mutilated bodies. Not even a powerful explosion could have split, ripped, and torn these fleshy masses more violently. We were floating amid gigantic corpses with bluish backs and whitish bellies, all deformed with enormous protuberances. A few frightened cachalots were seen fleeing toward the horizon. The waves were tinted with red for several miles around, and the Nautilus was sailing in a sea of blood. Captain Nemo joined us. "Well, Master Land?" he said. "Well, sir," replied the Canadian, whose enthusiasm had now cooled down. "It certainly was a remarkable spectacle. But I am not a butcher. I am a hunter, and this was just butchery." Butchery. What a good word. "It was a massacre of vicious animals," replied the captain, "and the Nautilus is not a butcher." "I prefer my harpoon," retorted the Canadian. "Each to his own harpoon," replied the captain, looking Ned straight in the eye. I was afraid that the Canadian might lose his temper and become violent, with serious consequences, but his anger was diverted by the sight of a whale that was floating near the Nautilus at that moment. The animal had not been able to escape the jaws of the cachalots. I recognized the black or southern whale with its flat head. Anatomically, it is distinguished from the white whale and the North Cape whale because its 7 cervical vertebrae are joined together, and it possesses 2 ribs more than its cousins. The ill-fated cetacean was floating on its side, its belly ripped open with the bites it had received. It was dead. A little baby whale, which it had not been able to save during the carnage, still hung on the tip of its mutilated fin. Its mouth was open, and the water flowing over its whalebone murmured like the breakers of an undertow. Captain Nemo brought the Nautilus alongside the animal's body. 2 of the crew leaped on the whale's side, and, not without some surprise, I saw them drawing 2 or 3 casks of milk from her breasts. The captain offered me a cup of this milk, which was still warm. I could not help showing him the repugnance I felt for this beverage. He assured me that the milk was excellent, and that it could not be distinguished in any way from the milk of a cow. I tasted it, and agreed with him. Made into salted butter or cheese, it provided us with additional stock, an excellent change in our usual diet. From the day on, I noticed with some uneasiness that Ned Land's hostility toward the captain was becoming increasingly worse. I decided to keep a very close watch on the Canadian. Okay, that was chapter 12. Another exciting chapter with whale fights and whatever. Chapter 13, Under the Ice Shelf. The Nautilus had resumed her steady course toward the south. She was following the line of the 50th meridian at a considerable speed. Was it intended to go as far as the pole? I don't think so, for so far all attempts to reach it had failed. Moreover, the season had already corresponded to September 13th in the north. Had already very far advanced, since March 13th in the Antarctic corresponds to September 13th in the north, at which time the equinoctial period begins. Wow, that's so cool. Also cool to hear the word equinoctial, meaning equinox time. So cool. On March 14th, I noticed floating ice at a latitude 55°. These were, however, just thinnish, shadowy blocks, 20 to 25 feet long, forming reefs against which the sea broke into foam. The Nautilus. Cheap viewers! Wow! I've always wanted a cheap viewer. Sorry, I had to get rid of that message in chat. Forming reefs against the sea which broke in the foam. The Nautilus cruised on the surface. Ned Land, having fished in Arctic waters, was familiar with icebergs, while Conseil and I were admiring them for the first time. On the horizon to the south, dazzling streak of white appeared. English whalers had given it the name of ice blink, and however thick the clouds may be, they cannot dim its brightness. This strip indicates the presence of an ice pack, or a blank of ice. Indeed, we soon came across much bigger blocks of ice, whose brightness varied according to the whims of the mist. Some of these masses had green veins, as though wavy lines of copper sulfate had been drawn through them. Others looked like enormous amethysts, reflecting the sun's rays in 1,000 crystal facets, while others, colored by brilliant particles of limestone, looked like great masses of marble, sufficient to build a whole city. The farther down we sailed, the more numerous and bigger these floating islands became. Polar birds were nestling on them by the thousands. There were petrels, damiers, and puffins defeating us with their cries. Some of them, mistaking the Nautilus for the dead body of a whale, aligned on our hull, and we could hear them pecking at its steel plates. During this voyage through the ice, Captain Nemo spent much time on the platform, observing these desolate regions with attention. Occasionally, the calm expression on his face became animated. Was he thinking that this was his home, where that he was the master of all these polar regions inaccessible to man? Perhaps, but he did not say anything. He stood motionless, and only sorry. Oh, uh, I lost my spot. He stood motionless and only emerged from his thoughts when his helmsman instincts got the upper hand. My God, I keep losing my spot. Then, steering the Nautilus with consummate skill, he would avoid a collision with those masses of ice, some of which were several miles long and about 200 to 250 feet high. Not infrequently, they actually seemed to blot out the horizon. When we reached 60 degrees latitude, every passage seemed to have disappeared. But Captain Nemo, after a careful search, would soon find some narrow opening through which he would slip boldly, although he knew very well that the gap would close in behind him. The Nautilus, steered by his skillful hand, advanced through those masses of ice, which are classified with a precision that delighted Conseil. They are classified. They are classified according to their shape or size, as icebergs or mountains, ice fields, vast, boundless plains, drift ice or floating ice packs or broken up fields, called places when round in shape, that streams when they are long and narrow. The temperature was rather low, the outside thermometer registering 2° or 4° below zero, or 27 or 29 degrees Fahrenheit. But we were warmly dressed in furs, thanks to the seals and polar bears. The inside of the Nautilus, heated by electricity, maintained an even temperature against the severest cold. Moreover, we could always dive down a few fathoms to find a milder temperature. We had come here 2 months sooner. We should have enjoyed continuous daylight in this latitude. Nights were even now no more than 3 or 4 hours long, but later night would cast its shadow for 6 long months over these polar regions. On March 15th, we passed the latitude of the New Shetland and Orkney Islands. The captain informed me that large herds of seals had formerly inhabited this area, but the English and American whalers had wantonly massacred both the males and the pregnant females, leaving in their wake nothing but silence and death. On March 16th, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, the Nautilus, following the 55th meridian, closed the Antarctic Circle. We were surrounded by ice on all sides, so that the horizon was totally obscured. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo found one passage after another and continued his progress southward. "Where is he headed for?" I asked. "Straight ahead, I would say," replied Conseil. "After all, when he can't go any further, he will stop." "I wouldn't be so sure about that," I replied. Frankly, I must admit that I was very much pleased with this new adventure, and I cannot express my delight at the beauty of those strange regions. The ice created the most superb formations, sometimes resembling an oriental city with innumerable minarets and mosques, sometimes a ruined town destroyed by an earthquake. The scenery kept constantly changing, varied by the rays of the sun or lost in the gray mists of a snowstorm. All around we could hear the sounds of ice cracking, crumbling, falling, or the loud rumblings of colliding icebergs, changing the scenery into spectacular and translucent landscapes. Whenever the Nautilus submerged to avoid these upheavals, the crashing sounds echoed through the water with frightening intensity. And when the masses of ice fell back in the sea, they created a turmoil that made the Nautilus pitch and toss like a ship caught in the fury of a hurricane. At times I could not see any way out of this maze, and feared that we were definitely imprisoned without any hope of escaping. But Captain Nemo, guided by his instinct and taking advantage of the slightest opening, found new passages to sail through. He never seemed to err in judging the thin shreds of bluish water running through those ice fields. There was no doubt in my mind that he had sailed through these polar regions before with his Nautilus. 1 second. 50. Okay. However, on March 16th, my brother's birthday and Colin's birthday, our path was completely barred by ice fields. This was no mere pack ice, but a vast, continuous expanse, welded together by the cold. But this obstacle could stop Captain Nemo, and he launched his ship against the ice field with frightful violence. The Nautilus drove her way like a wedge into a brittle mass, breaking it up with terrible crackling sounds. It reminded one of those battering rams of ancient times, propelled with incredible force. Blocks of ice were thrown up into the air and rained down around us like hail. Our craft was creating her own channel by brute force. Occasionally, she overshot her point of impact, mounting the ice shelf and crushing it with her weight. Or else, finding herself hemmed in beneath the ice, would pitch about violently until she had rent wide cracks in it. Some days we were hit by violent, swirling gales. These brought with them thick fogs that made it impossible to see what the other end of the platform to the other. Sudden winds would spring up in every direction, and snow would pile up into such hard layers that it had to be chipped off with a pick. When the temperature dropped below 5 degrees Celsius or 23 degrees Fahrenheit, all the Nautilus would be covered with ice. A vessel with rigging would never have managed it. The ropes would have become stuck in the pulleys. Only a ship driven by electricity rather than coal could have faced those high latitudes. The barometer, under these conditions, my light just went off, remained very, very low. It even dropped to 73 degrees 5. Even the compass could no longer be relied on, for its needle could madly move in all directions as we approached the South Magnetic Pole, which is not to be confused with the South Pole itself. Indeed, according to Hanston, the pole is situated approximately at latitude 70 degrees and longitude 130 degrees, while Dupree gives a position of 70 degrees 30 and 135 degrees. We therefore had to take numerous readings of the compass at different points of the ship and strike an average often, which we had to resort to a rough estimate in tracing our course, not a very satisfactory method in view of our zigzag path through the ice and our continual shift of position. Finally, on March 18th, after 20 fruitless attempts, the Nautilus found itself completely frozen in. What lay ahead of us was neither a platch, nor a stream, nor a field, but an endless, solid chain of mountains of ice. "What great ice shelf!" exclaimed Ned. I realized that for Ned Land, as for all the navigators who had gone before us, this was the impassable obstacle. Toward noon, the sun came out for a moment, and Captain Nemo was able to take a fairly accurate bearing, which gave our position as longitude 51 degree 30 by longitude 67 degree 39. We were already deep into the Antarctic regions. There was no sign of the sea or water anywhere. Beyond the prow of the Nautilus there stretched a vast, uneven plain, littered with a confused mass of ice blocks, with all the hazardous disorder that is typical of a river just before the ice breaks up. But this was on a gigantic scale. Here and there we could see sharp peaks, slender as needles and rising to a height of 200 feet. Farther on, there was a series of steep, grayish cliffs which reflected, like vast mirrors, the rays of the sun, half lost in the mist. In these desolate surroundings, there was an eerie silence, occasionally broken by petrels or puffins flapping their wings. Everything was frozen, including the sounds. The Nautilus had been forced to halt her adventurous course in the middle of the ice. "Monsieur," Ned Land said to me that day, if your captain can move beyond this, yes, he will be a superman indeed." "Why, Ned?" "Because no one can break through the ice shelf. Your captain may be a superman, but by heavens, he's not stronger than nature. And when nature sets up her barriers, you have to stop, whether you like it or not." "Quite true, Ned. And yet, I should like to know what is behind all that ice." "There is nothing more frustrating than to be faced by a wall." "Monsieur is right," said Conseil. "Walls were just invented to frustrate professors. There shouldn't be any walls anywhere." Fucking Conseil. He's just like, whatever Arana says is golden. Doesn't matter if he's talking about a wall. He's right about that wall. "Well," said the Canadian, everyone knows what's behind that barrier." "What?" I asked. "Just ice. Lots more ice." "You seem to be sure of your facts, Ned," I replied, "but I am not. That is why should like to take a look at what lies beyond. I'm afraid you'll have to give up that idea, Professor, replied the Canadian. You've come to a great ice shelf, which is good enough, but you won't get any farther. Nor will your Captain Nemo and his Nautilus. Whether he likes it or not, we'll just have to turn back to the north, to countries inhabited by sensible human beings. I agree that Ned was right. Until ships are built to float over seas of ice, we are immobilized before the great ice shelf. Indeed, despite all efforts and despite the powerful means employed to dislodge the ice, the Nautilus was reduced to immobility. Normally, he can go no further, is free to retrace his steps, but this was just as impossible as going forward, for the passengers had closed up in our wake, and our ship, which was now motionless, would very soon be frozen in completely. And this is precisely what happened at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when fresh ice formed along the hull of the ship with astonishing rapidity. I was forced to admit that Captain Nemo had been more than reckless. I was then on the platform. The captain, who had been surveying the position for some minutes, said to me, "Well, Professor, what do you think about this?" "I should say that we're trapped, Captain." "Trapped? What do you mean by that?" "I just mean that we cannot go forward, cannot go backward, and we cannot go sideways. And that is the usual meaning of trapped. At least, that is what we would say on the continent." "So, Monsieur Aronnax, you believe the Nautilus will not be able to extricate herself, do you?" "It will be extremely difficult, Captain, for the season is already too far advanced, and you are counting on the ice breaking up." "Ah, Monsieur le Professeur," replied Captain Nemo, in an ironical tone of voice, "you never change, do you? You never see anything but impediments and obstacles. I can assure you that not only will the Nautilus break free, but she will go still farther." "Farther south?" I asked, looking at the captain. "Yes, monsieur. We will be going to the pole." "To the pole?" I exclaimed, unable to conceal my incredulity. "Yes," replied the captain with cool assurance, "to the South Pole, that unknown region where all the meridians of the earth intersect. The Nautilus, as you know, will do whatever I command it to do." Yes, I knew that. I also knew that this man was bold and incredibly reckless. But to reach the South Pole, more inaccessible than the North Pole, a desolate area bristling with obstacles and the boldest navigators have failed to conquer, this was an utterly reckless venture which only a madman could conceive. Then the idea struck me to ask the captain whether he had, in fact, already discovered that pole on which no man had ever set foot. "No, monsieur," he replied, "but we will discover it together. Where others have failed, I will not fail. I have never sailed the Nautilus this far south, but, as I have already told you, we will continue to move south." "I should like to believe you, Captain," I said, somewhat ironically. "I believe you. By all means, let us go forward. There are no obstacles for us. Of course, let us smash the barrier. Let us blow it up. And if it resists our efforts, let us put wings on the Nautilus and let us fly right over it." "Fly over it, Monsieur le Professeur," replied the captain calmly. "No, monsieur, not over it, but under it." "Under it?" I cried. Suddenly, the captain's plan flashed in my mind. I realized what he meant to do. Once more, the incredible powers of the Nautilus were going to be used in a superhuman undertaking. I see we are beginning to understand each other, Professor, the captain said to me, a trace of a smile on his lips. Now you can see the possibility. I should say, the success of this venture. What is impractical with an ordinary ship becomes easy with the Nautilus. If the mainland of a continent is situated at the pole, we shall stop short of that land. But if, on the other hand, there is an open sea underneath, we shall reach the pole itself. Of course, I said, carried away by the captain's reasoning. Even if the surface of the sea is frozen solid, the lower levels are not. There is a providential law of nature that causes water to expand when its temperature reaches the freezing point, thereby lowering its specific gravity or density. Because of this lower density, ice is lighter than water and rises to the surface. Moreover, if I am not mistaken, that part of an ice shelf that rises above the surface of the water is only 1/4 of what lies beneath it. Am I right, Captain? More or less, Professor. But every foot of iceberg above the surface, these are 3 feet below. Now, since these mountains of ice are no higher than 300 feet, it follows that what lies below the surface cannot be greater than 900 feet. And after all, what is 900 feet to the Nautilus? Nothing, of course, Captain. Furthermore, we can dive even deeper and take advantage of the uniform temperature that exists in the depths of the ocean. And once there, the temperature of 30 or 40 degrees below zero on the surface of the ice will not affect us. Naturally, naturally, I replied excitedly. The only difficulty, Captain Nemo resumed, will be to remain submerged for several days without renewing our air supply. Is that all? I replied. But the Nautilus has huge tanks. We can fill them up, and they will provide us with all the oxygen we need. You are quite right, Monsieur Aronnax, the captain rejoined, smiling. But since I do not want you to accuse me of foolhardiness, I am acquainting you with all the possible obstacles that may arise. You mean there are other obstacles? Just one. It is possible that if there is an open sea at the South Pole, it may be completely frozen solid, so that we may not be able to emerge to the surface. But you forget, Captain, that the Nautilus is armed with a redoubtable spur, which we could drive diagonally through the ice and tear it open, don't you think? Congratulations, Professor. You are full of excellent ideas today. Moreover, Captain, I continued, becoming more and more enthusiastic. Why should there not be an open sea at the South Pole, as there is on the North Pole? The poles of cold temperatures and the poles of the globe do not coincide, either in the Arctic or in the Antarctic, and until we have proof to the contrary, we must assume that these two regions of the earth is either a continent or an open sea. I believe so. I believe that too, Monsieur Aronnax, replied Captain Nemo. However, I should like to point out that after you raised so many objections to my plan, you are now destroying all my arguments and are in favor of it. What Captain Nemo said was true. I was actually going so far as to outdo him in audacity. It was I who was now urging him to go to the pole. I was outpacing him, outstripping him. How could I be such a presumptuous fool? Captain Nemo knew the pros and cons of the question far better than I, and he was merely amusing himself to see me carried away by my dreams of the impossible. Meanwhile, He had not lost a moment. He sent for his second in command, and the two men entered into a rapid conversation in their incomprehensible language. Whether the other man had been apprised in advance, or whether he found the plan entirely practicable, I didn't know, but he showed no surprise. Impassive as he may have been, Conseil was even more so. When I told this worthy lad that our plans were to press onward to the South Pole, he just greeted the news with his usual, as monsieur pleases, and I had to be satisfied with that. Ned Land, however, shrugged his shoulders more emphatically than ever. Really, Professor, he said, I cannot help feeling sorry for you and your Captain Nemo. But we are going to the pole, Ned. Perhaps, but you'll never come back. With that, Ned returned to his cabin to keep from doing something desperate, as he said on leaving us. Meanwhile, the preparations for this daring venture had begun. The powerful pumps on the Nautilus were filling the tanks and storing them under high pressure. At about 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo announced that the hatches leading to the platform were going to be closed. I cast a final glance at the thick ice shelf, which we were about to cross. The weather was fine, the visibility fairly clear, and the temperature was 12 degrees below zero Celsius. But since the wind had dropped, the temperature did not seem at all unbearable. About 10 members of the crew, armed with picks, then went out onto the sides of the Nautilus and proceeded to break up the ice that had formed around her hull. This did not take very long, for the ice was still fairly thin. Then we all went back inside the ship. The tanks were filled with available water, and the Nautilus dived without further delay. I took to the saloon with Conseil. Through the open panels, we looked out into those lower reachings of the southern sea. The thermometer was rising, and the needle of the manometer began to fluctuate across the dial. At about 900 feet, just as the captain had predicted, we were navigating below the undulated surface of the ice shelf. But the Nautilus went deeper still, reaching to a depth of 2,500 feet. The temperature of the water, which had been 12 degrees below 0 Celsius at the surface, was now no more than 11 degrees. At the depth, it had risen 2 degrees already. Needless to say, the temperature inside the Nautilus, heated by electricity, was much higher. All the ship's movements were executed with extraordinary precision. "If Monsieur doesn't mind me saying so, I think we will get through," remarked Conseil. "Indeed we will," I replied in a tone of deep conviction. In these open waters, the Nautilus headed straight for the pole, without deviating from the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 to 90 degrees, we still had 22.5 degrees of latitude to go, from 500 leagues, or more than 1,000 miles. The Nautilus was averaging 26 knots, the speed of an excessive train. If we maintain this speed, If we maintain this speed, 40 hours would suffice to reach the pole. The novelty of the situation kept Conseil and me peering out of the window for a good part of the night. The sea was bright in the rays of our searchlight, but it was deserted. There was no fish in these waters. They used these waters only as a passage from the Antarctic Ocean to the open polar seas. They were moving fast. Where was I? We could guess the speed by the vibrations of the long steel hull. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I retired for a few hours' rest. Conseil did likewise. On my way along the corridor, I did not meet Captain Nemo, and I supposed that he was on duty at the helmsman cage. The next day, March 19th, at 5 o'clock in the morning, I returned to my place in the saloon. From the electric log, I could see that the speed of the Nautilus had been reduced. We were rising to the surface with caution, emptying our tanks slowly. My heart was beating fast. Would we emerge to breathe the fresh air of the polar sea? No. A sudden shock made me realize that the Nautilus had struck the underside of the ice shelf, still very thick, judging by the dull sound I heard. We had indeed collided, but it was an upward collision, as mariners would say, at a depth of 3,000 feet. This meant that we had 4,000 feet of ice above us, in which 1,000 feet protruded above the surface. Here, then, the ice shelf was higher than it had been when we submerged. Not a very consoling thought. Throughout the day, the Nautilus repeated the experiment, each time, however, striking the icy ceiling above it. Sometimes it struck the ice at 2,700 feet, which meant a total thickness of 3,600 feet, of which 900 was above the surface. This was double the height of the shelf at the point where the Nautilus had first dived under. I took careful note of the various depths, and I was able to obtain an outline of the underside of this chain of icy mountains. By nightfall, our predicament had not changed. The ice above us was still between 1,200 and 1,500 feet thick. This indicated that the thickness of the wall of ice was decreasing. But what an impenetrable mountain of ice still lay between us and the surface of the sea. It was then 8 o'clock. According to our daily routine, the air inside the Nautilus would have been renewed 4 hours before. However, I was not feeling it too much, even though Captain Nemo had not been decided to use his reserve tanks. I slept very uneasily that night, assailed as I was by hope and fear. I got up several times. The Nautilus continued to grope her way. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I noticed that we were striking the lower surface of the ice shelf at 150 feet. Only 150 feet of ice separated us from the surface. Gradually, the shelf was becoming thinner and turned into an ice field. That mountain of ice was slowly turning into a plain. I could not take my eyes off of the manometer. We were still rising diagonally, moving slowly toward the surface, which we could see glistening beneath the rays of our searchlight. Above, below, and all around us, the ice shelf spread out like a long ramp, which grew visibly thinner as we progressed, mile by mile. Finally, at 6 o'clock in the morning, on that memorable day of March 19th, the door of the saloon opened, and Captain Nemo appeared. "The open sea," he said. He did it, that Captain Nemo. Okay, that was chapter 13 of part 2 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Guys, we made it. We did it. All right. That was cool. I was very engaged with those chapters. I loved the icy landscape of it all. Winter is like my favorite season. Okay, let's mark what we got up to in Storygraph. So we are at page 351. So we started at 66% of the way through the book. And now we are 73% of the way of the book. So we are certainly getting there, which is exciting. And yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely, lovely day, night, whatever you are having. And I will be back tomorrow for a writing stream in the morning and to continue this book in the evening. So I will see you very soon. Good night.